Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, where I cover vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural creatures. In this video we're going to be looking at the sequel to 30 Days of Night, called 30 Days of Night Dark Days. This movie came out in 2010 and features none of the original cast, but is a direct continuation of the story and tells us more about what happened in the first film. Let's take a look at 30 Days of Night Dark Days, the continuation of Eban and Stella's story from the first movie, a vampire that somehow retained his humanity, and the vampire queen, Lilith. The movie begins with a quick flashback of the events from the first movie to remind us what happened. Beryl was attacked by the vampires and nearly everyone was killed. She sits with Eban in his final moments as he's burned by the rising sun. In this movie, Stella is played by a different actor now, so don't let that confuse you. This is the same person as this. 98 people were killed during those 30 days of night. The incident was blamed on a faulty pipeline that caused an oil explosion. If you remember, the vampires set the town on fire at the end of the film to cover their tracks. Stella tried to tell them what really happened, but obviously no one believed her. They rebuilt the town and life went on. But not for her. She never wanted a war, but she might just get one. I really like the intro titles. Okay, so after what happened, Stella has made it her goal to expose the vampire species. She has been traveling around for 10 months giving seminars about what happened. One day she starts receiving letters from a mysterious person named Dane. He knew things that no one else did about vampires. We see Dane writing some of these letters. He tells her they have moved to Philadelphia. They're like rats. They know who you are. They're in Los Angeles. Signed, Dane. Stella is now in Los Angeles, about to give another one of her talks on vampires. She wakes up from a nightmare, and on the bedside table she has pills and a gun, giving us an idea of how she's doing. Not good. We skip ahead and she's in a large auditorium talking to a crowd of seated people. She tells the story of what happened in Barrow and states it wasn't a faulty pipeline, and those 98 people didn't die in an oil fire. The truth is, when the sun set for 30 days in the town of Barrow, Alaska, it came under siege by a clan of vampires. Some people laugh, but she says, it's alright. People always laugh, but tonight will be different. Vampires go to great lengths to stay hidden, so usually a few show up. That's why she installed UV lights with the same power as the sun in the roof. She gives the vampires one chance to show themselves, then turns on the lights.
Hit the lights.
The vampires in the crowd begin to scream and burn while the rest of the crowd runs and flees in panic. As everyone else freaks out, Stella leaves the building, walking calmly. When Stella exits the building, there's a bunch of cops waiting for her. An FBI agent sits her down and tells her what those people saw was a hoax, right? He tries to spin it like she's very upset about Eban's death and is delusional. He's coughing very badly throughout the interview. Stella says, if it's a hoax, why send the FBI? He immediately changes his tune and says, if it was up to him, he'd kill her and bury her in the desert. But others think that would attract too much attention. We can infer that by others, he probably means the vampires. She asks, who are you? But he simply replies, the bodies are already in the incinerator. No one will believe you. So that pretty much confirms the FBI, or at least this guy is working with the vampires. Stella leaves defeated, and while in the car whispers, sorry Eb, as in Eban. She enters her motel room, and when she turns on the light, there's a group of strangers waiting for her. They were sent by Dane, the same person that sent the letters. Stella is angry and confused, but they calm her down and share stories of how each one of them lost someone they loved to vampires, and no one believed them. Their names are Paul, Todd, and Amber. Now they hunt vampires. Stella says, you don't hunt vampires, they hunt you. Amber gets mad and says, see, I told you, and steps outside. They continue to talk to Stella about joining them, but outside, a vampire has arrived. It appears on the roof and effortlessly jumps down onto the ground. Amber runs back in and says, they found us. They found her, implying that the vampires are now actively looking for Stella. Not surprising after her little stunt. The vampire tries to break through the door, but they pin him there and blow his head off. Looks like these guys really do know how to hunt vampires. Stella decides to go with them to meet Dane. In the car, Stella asks, what was up with that FBI guy? Is he one of them? Todd says no, he's a bug eater. Wannabes. They do the bidding of Lilith, and in return, she promises them immortality. Stella wants to know who this Lilith is. She's the one they're after. Queen Bee. She was actually married to Vicente, the lead vampire from the first film. so that means he was like a king of vampires. Amber's still worried that Stella isn't one of them and is gonna get them killed, but the others insist it's what Dane wanted. We see the FBI agent at the motel where Stella was, and again, he's coughing harshly. After what Todd said, I think we can already put together that he has something seriously wrong with him and is probably working for Lilith to save himself.
Well, enjoying the view?
The group arrives at Dane's and they enter his home. Once inside, Stella gets the surprise of a lifetime. Dane, the one who told her to come to LA, the leader of the vampire hunters, is a vampire. She grabs the gun right away and points it at him. Paul tells Stella he's not like the others. Dane goes on to explain that his wound was superficial, meaning it was probably just a minor scratch. Somehow, this allowed him to hold on to some piece of his humanity. Stella wants to know how he feeds, and he grabs a blood bag out of the mini fridge and pours it into a glass. In the fridge, there's all different types of blood, so they don't seem to have a preference. He tries to convince Stella to help them by tempting her with revenge. They show Stella a layout of the vampire's hideout in some old service tunnels. They have a plan to break in there and kill Lilith. Once they tell Stella that Lilith would have been the one responsible for organizing the attack on Barrow, she's a little more enthusiastic, but still not 100% sure. Breaking into a vampire hideout seems insane, and it is. They're also going during the day, which means Dane can't go with them. Meanwhile, the FBI agent is called in by Lilith. When he arrives, she's bathing in blood, surrounded by her servants. We don't know exactly where she is, but the room looks to be made of steel. She gets out of the bath and approaches Agent Norris. She wants to know what he did about the witnesses and the Alaskan. He tells her that he scared her away, but it looks like Lilith doesn't believe him, because she wants to know how he can be so sure. Then has one of her bodyguards headbutt him. This guy looks like a mix between Lurch and Uncle Fester from the Addams Family. Back in town, the vampire hunters are ready to attack, and Stella has reluctantly agreed to join them. While entering the nest, Todd cuts his hand on a piece of metal and bleeds on the ground. They continue into the tunnel like nothing happened, which is kinda weird that a group of vampire hunters weren't worried about a guy bleeding while they're sneaking into a vampire nest. Seems like that might be a problem, and is most likely why they ultimately get found by the vampires. As they go deeper into the tunnel, Amber begins to panic, saying this isn't how they usually do things. She tries to turn around, but is met by the sight of a vampire. They are attacked by more vampires and have to run down the tunnel and try to escape. In the scuffle, Todd is bitten by a vampire, and they're getting low on ammo. They grab Todd and run down the tunnel and luckily find a room with a thick metal door they can lock. They are safe from the other vampires for now, but Todd is already starting to turn. We know from the first movie it only takes a few minutes for somebody to change. Those with extremely strong willpower can hold on a little while, such as Eban, but sooner or later, you lose yourself.
It's okay. Kill me.
Paul is holding the knife, but can't bring himself to do it. He drops the knife and says, "I can't. I'm not doing it." He tries to appeal to Todd's humanity and tells him to fight it, but he can't. Todd lunges at Paul and Stella is forced into action. She grabs a large rock and smashes Todd's head to smithereens while letting out a primal yell. Once she calms down, she turns to Paul and says, "I thought you've done this before." He says they have, but never to one of their own. Stella tells him to get used to it. Amber starts to panic again, and Stella tells her to try and calm down and not get anyone else killed. This causes Amber to freak out and point the gun at Stella, saying, "You think this is my fault?" Stella calmly looks up at the barrel of the gun and says, "You'd be doing me a favor." Damn. Also, it's kind of funny that Amber was so worried about Stella getting one of them killed, and then she ends up getting one of them killed. Everyone calms down a bit, and Paul wants to know what they should do. Should they try to leave? Stella suggests their best bet is to stay put for now since they're low on ammo. Stella falls asleep for a bit, and when she wakes up, Paul checks the door. He opens the viewing hole, and a vampire appears. But Paul opens the door anyway. Stella's about to stop him, and realizes it's Dane. He says they've all gone to feed, so it's safe to leave. They walk down the tunnel with Dane, and he suddenly stops and puts his hand up, gesturing them to pause. A moment later, a vampire appears and they easily shoot him. But he's not dead. Stella decides to take the vampire back to their base to try to get some answers. We get another cutaway to Lilith torturing a couple. They are brought in and she pulls out the man's teeth with her bare hands, then proceeds to kiss him as the man's mouth gushes with blood. Honestly, all the scenes with Lilith are pretty cool. At the hideout, they torture the vampire by using a UV light to burn his skin. He isn't saying anything until Dane starts talking to him in their ancient vampire language. We don't know what he says, but somehow he gets the vampire to give up some information. There will be another attack on Barrow, and the sun sets in 3 days. Now Stella knows she has to stop the vampires before that happens, so she's all in. Dane tells him to let the vampire go, and they follow him back to another vampire nest. They plant some explosives on the outside of the building and wait until daytime. They enter the warehouse quietly, looking around, and come upon some people tied up. Looks like some kind of place for vampires to come and feed. They slowly approach them and they look dead, but the woman is alive. She wakes up and freaks out, begging them to help her. They ask where the vampires are, and she says, "They're everywhere." Well, that's not good. Amber backs up and accidentally bumps into a bucket, and a vampire jumps down from the roof attacking her. When the vampire lands on her, the detonator for the explosives is knocked out of her hand. They get completely surrounded by the vampires, and Stella shoots some holes in the roof that make a barrier of light between them and the vampires. She dives for the detonator and manages to get it. She hits the button and blows a large hole in the wall, killing all the vampires. While unconscious, she has some flashbacks of Barrow, Alaska, then wakes up in the rubble with Paul and the others. They go back to Dane's with the girl they rescued, and Stella and Paul patch each other up and do the dirty. Agent Norris is currently reporting back to Lilith. He tells the Queen that it's Dane. He's helping them. He's been trailing them and knows where Dane's hideout is. The Queen tells him to take care of it, but he starts to cough violently into a handkerchief, and we see blood. He looks back at the Queen and says, "I'm running out of time. I want this. Please." She thinks about it for a moment and then says, "Show me." There is currently a crying girl laying on the floor, and Agent Norris approaches her. He readies himself, then grabs a hold of her. She fights back, but he overpowers her and bites onto her neck. The way it shows her skin being pulled away and then ripping in his teeth is gnarly. He proceeds to drink from her neck, and remember, he's still just a human. He stays there on his knees, waiting for the Queen, and she doesn't look disappointed. She approaches Agent Norris, cuts her wrist, and lets him drink the blood. This vampire virus can be spread by drinking blood, being bitten, or scratched. That's why in the first film, Vicente instructs the vampires to kill all victims because they don't want any new vampires. At Dane's hideout, the group is about to try talking to Jennifer, the girl they rescued. Jennifer says that she was brought on a ship full of bodies. Then some of them were brought ashore to be fed on. They ask if the Queen was on the ship. It's hard for Jennifer to remember, but she thinks that yes, she was. They ask if she remembers where the ship was, and Jennifer says she remembers army boats. Before they can get any further, there's a loud knock at the door. They all get scared and Dane slowly approaches. When he slides open the peephole for a look, he's shot in the head and killed. These vampires do have a healing ability, but they cannot survive heavy damage like being shot in the head. Shots to the body are a different story, as we see the vampire earlier take many gunshots to the body and was injured but would probably heal after feeding. These vampires are not weak to silver, garlic, crosses, holy water, or stakes to the heart. The best way to kill these vampires is sunlight or destroying the head. After Dane is shot, they run out the back door. The front door is kicked down, and standing there is Agent Norris, new and improved. They all run to the truck and manage to get away. They take Jennifer to the docks to see if she can recognize the ship, and right away, she does. She says, "That one," and points out a very large container ship. This explains why the Queen's room looked like it was made of metal and has pipes all over. It also explains the ship that we see in the first movie. The vampires use it as a moving fortress. Makes me wonder if during the first film, Lilith was on that ship. They tell Jennifer to take the truck and get as far away from here as possible. Then the rest of them prepare to sneak into the ship. They can't let it reach Barrow again. Paul suggests they call the Coast Guard, but Stella says, "And say what? There's a ship full of vampires?" They approach and see the guards loading bodies onto the ship. They wait till the coast is clear and enter. Right away they see the vampires uncover a body that looks like it's burnt. One of the vampires takes some blood and pours it into the corpse's mouth. A few seconds later, the body starts to rapidly heal and comes back to life. So these vampires can be killed, as we've seen with Dane, but they can also easily be brought back to life as long as the body isn't completely destroyed. This will be important later. The vampires walk away and they start making their way through the ship. That's when they feel something. The ship is moving. They are leaving for Barrow. Amber starts to panic again and suggests they jump ship and swim back to shore, but Stella says she can't do that. They find a map of the ship and make their way toward the navigation room to steer the ship off course, or turn it around. They come across a feeding room full of bodies. There's large stainless steel sinks with bodies in them draining, catching all the blood. The next room contains more bodies, this time hanging from the ceiling, draining into buckets. We see one of the women hung from the meat hooks is still alive. They exit the room and we see they're being followed by a vampire. They find the navigation room and point a gun at the captain. They want to know where the ship is headed, and he admits it's going to Alaska. Stella tells him to turn the ship around, but he says, "I can't." The vampires are holding the captain's family hostage. Amber is attacked from behind by a vampire, causing her to accidentally shoot the captain, killing him. They can't save Amber, so they have to shoot her to end her suffering. Stella and Paul are now surrounded by vampires and captured. The Queen emerges and tells the vampires to kill them. They're both hung from the ceiling by Agent Norris, and he plans on draining their blood. He cuts Paul's arm, but Stella manages to kick him and get off the hook. Agent Norris is much stronger than her, but she shoves the meat hook through his eye, causing him to panic. Then she grabs a fire axe off the wall and cuts his head off. They make their way back up to the navigation room, but neither of them know how to steer the ship. They decide the best thing they can do is destroy the controls. They succeed, but the Queen appears behind Paul and kills him. Stella retreats into the ship, and the Queen begins to stalk her, taunting her from the shadows.
Does it feel like it did in Barrow?
She eventually finds Stella and throws her around like a rag doll. Stella runs away again and ends up in the Queen's bathing room. She looks up at the pipes above, and a moment later, the Queen enters the room. But now Stella is nowhere to be seen. The Queen looks around for a minute and stops at the bath. She sees blood dripping into the bath and looks up smiling, seeing where Stella has gone. But that's when Stella pops out of the bathtub and cuts off her head before she can even react. The Queen is dead. The other vampires enter the room and just stand there. Stella approaches them slowly, and surprisingly, they step aside, letting Stella leave. I guess since she defeated their queen, they have some respect for her. Stella says she could let the ship drift into darkness, her along with it. However, we hear the US Coast Guard over the speakers and see Stella reach for the radio. It looks like she's thinking about it. Then we hear a helicopter approaching, so she did decide to call for help. Stella says what they found on that ship was never on the news. No one ever talked about it. This implies the vampires still have some kind of hierarchy set up, and enough control to make sure whatever was found on that ship never got out. Stella thought about searching for more people with stories like hers, but she already knows one. Stella is now in a different bed, and when she goes outside, we can tell it's Alaska. She walks into the snow and arrives at Eban's grave and starts to dig. She brings the body home and stares at it for a while, then reveals Eban's charred corpse. She cuts her hand and lets some of the blood drip into his mouth. She waits, but nothing happens. She makes another cut and drips more blood, but again, nothing. Maybe he was dead too long. She passes out, probably from a mixture of blood loss and overwhelming emotion. She wakes up a while later, and Eban is standing over her body. She gets up and looks at him, then wraps her arms around him, saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe it's you." As the camera pans around to finally reveal Eban's face, his eyes are completely black, and his mouth opens wide, revealing his fangs just as the movie cuts. It looks like ultimately Stella is turned into a vampire as well. Eban managed to retain his humanity for a few hours after being turned, but it looks like the virus has completely taken over him now. Dane said his wound was superficial, surface level. Eban, on the other hand, injected himself with vampire blood, so he would have gotten the full dose. It's pretty crazy that these vampires can be burned up by the sun, buried for 10 or 11 months, then brought back to life. Now that Stella is out of the way, I wonder if the vampires will continue their siege on Barrow, Alaska. That's my video on 30 Days of Night, Dark Days. I think we can all agree the first film is one of the best vampire horror films of all time. Dark Days, on the other hand, is a big step down. It kind of pulled in aliens and made the monsters less threatening, which takes away from the horror. Don't get me wrong, I love the movie Aliens, but you can't argue it has a different style from the first film. Same here. The reviews on this movie are horrendous, but I think it does have some redeeming qualities. I like the opening of the movie with the vampires getting burned in the auditorium. The introduction of Lilith, the queen vampire, her appearance and mannerisms are great. She really feels like a vampire queen. Noble, but scary and downright sadistic. I also like the introduction of Dane being a vampire that could control his humanity because he was only infected by a small amount of the virus. The rest of the movie, I could take it or leave it. If you're interested in learning more about 30 Days of Night, I made a video about how the original attack on Barrow was against the vampire's rules, the queen's backstory, who the actual original vampire is, and more. I read through the comics and novels to make that video, so it was a lot of work, but well worth it, because you would not believe what happens to Lilith. Of course, as always, if there's any other movies, TV shows, or video games you want me to cover, please leave them in the comments down below. I've been waiting years for the new Blade to come out, so maybe someday we can cover that. If you enjoyed, leave a like, and subscribe if you haven't. It helps the channel and I really appreciate it. As always, an extra shout out to all my members for supporting the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.